Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Glenn Beckmann, Communications Manager at GNSI, and your host for At the Boundary today. On the show, we're going to be talking about a new project we're taking on here at GNSI, the study of internal conflict. SOIC is a research project that's the passion project for Dr. Chris Mason, an assistant professor in the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He's going to be talking with our own resident resiliency and resistance expert, Dr. Rob Burell. But before we bring those two fine gents into the studio, there are a couple of quick notes I want to relay. Our latest newsletter dropped last week featuring a story on our own doctors Jeff Rogg and Arman Mahmoudian writing an article for the National Interest titled The Middle East's New Axis. Other stories in this newsletter include an update on our upcoming Policy Dialogues online discussion, Transatlantic Forum on Cybersecurity, as well as a story on our latest decision brief focused on putting the warrior spirit back into the U.S. military. Speaking of decision briefs, we're putting out an open call for submissions for future decision briefs. Specifically, right now, we're looking for submissions on the topic of maritime security. This topic, quite literally, can cover the globe amidst the limitless number of issues involved with it. We'd love to hear your ideas and welcome your submissions. Decision briefs are designed to be concise analyses of specific topics in quick-to-read and easy-to-understand form. You can find all of the publishing submission directions and guidelines on our website. We'll drop a link in the show notes. Our final note today, congratulations to the new executive leadership of FSP, the Future Strategist Program. Penelope Cassini is the newly elected president. Sandra Malloy and Sasha Hossain are the vice president co-chairs, while Amelia McLeod is the new FSP secretary. May Birch is the events coordinator for 25-26, and Sophia Nobles and Calvin Pham are the new social media coordinators. Congratulations to all of you. It's hard to believe we're approaching the one-year anniversary already for FSP. Working with this group of students for the past year has been a fantastic experience for the entire GNSI team. They are on a rocket ship trajectory. If you're interested or know someone who would be interested in FSP, send us a message here at ATB. Okay, let's bring into the studio our two special guests today, Doctors Rob Burell and Chris Mason. Rob is a senior research fellow here at GNSI. He's also on the editorial board of the Journal of Strategic Competition, as well as a non-resident fellow for the Irregular Warfare Initiative. He's also our very own expert on resiliency and resistance, having authored several articles on that topic for us. He's going to be speaking today with Dr. Chris Mason, an assistant professor at the U.S. Army War College. When he joined AWC in 2014, Mason began a research project called the Study of Internal Conflict. It's become a passion project of his, and now, over 10 years and 150 case studies later, that project is finding a new home here at USF and with GNSI. Here are Doctors Rob Burell and Chris Mason.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction. Today we have a special episode discussing irregular warfare, specifically both insurgency and counterinsurgency. We are also unveiling a new initiative at GNSI called Resilience and Resistance Studies. One of our first accomplishments in resilience and resistance studies is bringing a large body of knowledge about irregular warfare called the Study of Internal Conflict to the University of South Florida. This is a pretty big deal. Consequently, we have a number of USF students on this call to hear about this research program and to ask questions. Our special guest today is Dr. Chris Mason. Chris is a retiring professor at the U.S. Army War College and the leading academic coordinating efforts and scholarship contributing to the study of internal conflict. Chris is also a retired Foreign Service officer. He has worked in and on Afghanistan for 20 years. His book, The Strategic Lessons Unlearned from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Why the Afghan National Army Will Not Hold, predicted the collapse of the Afghan National Army several years before it happened, Dr. Mason holds a bachelor's degree with honors from Carnegie Mellon University. He graduated with distinction from the Resident Command and General Staff College at the Marine Corps University. Hoorah, shout out. And he also holds a PhD in military and Central Asian history from none other than George Washington University. Good morning, Chris. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Rob. I'm glad to be here. This is exciting.
I know. I'm really excited. So you've had a long career of service, both in the State Department as well as the Department of Defense. Is there anything you want to highlight which I missed in your introduction?
No, I mean, I think you hit all the high points there.
Yeah, your book, which predicted the fall of Afghanistan, pretty amazing foretelling. Is that tied to this study of internal conflict and the results that you've been working on?
I think it was kind of the seed kernel of the study of internal conflict. As I was writing the book in 2014, it occurred to me that there might be a way to quantify why governments lose internal conflicts. It seemed to me that there were some recurring themes there, and it sort of planted the seed of using statistical analysis to determine why government failure occurs in insurgency and civil war.
Awesome. Yeah. What a great academic accomplishment. Not great for Afghanistan, but really shows your understanding of insurgency and counterinsurgency in that book, which is great, by the way. You should buy it. It's on Amazon. Chris, I think our listeners would first like to know what the study of internal conflict is. Can you describe what this program is?
Oh, sure. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by 2014 were already going sideways, and there were all sorts of theories about why that was happening. There was all sorts of doctrine and sort of counterinsurgency voodoo that I thought needed to be analyzed, and so find a way to. I thought that we needed to find a way to cut through, all of those pet theories about insurgency and counterinsurgency, and so I came up with the idea of using just statistical analysis, regression analysis on why governments fail. So, and it took a while. It took until 2017 to create a viable research plan and establish a timeline and scope of work that the Strategic Studies Institute would agree to. So the study was launched out in 2017 with the creation of the study of internal conflict. And over the past 8 years, more than 150 researchers have contributed to the program, and I'm really excited about the prospect of having students at GNSI at University of South Florida get involved in this and continue working with military officers and government officials now that this data will be on your website as well. I guess I should explain a little bit about how we went about approaching creating a database for the study of internal conflict.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so we needed to first create a database of conflicts, and we decided to start with 1945 as the baseline year and move forward from there. And rather than recreate the wheel, we just went with the correlates of war database with some filters applied. We didn't have the power, we didn't have the bandwidth to do all of the conflicts, so we went with the largest ones, establishing a baseline of at least 1,000 fatalities in a 12-month period during some point in the conflict, which included security forces, insurgents, and the civilians in the battlefield. And then, of course, the government had to be a party to the conflict. because we were trying to determine whether the government won or lost. And there are a lot of conflicts out there in which the government's not a party to the conflict, just two groups of citizens of the same country fighting each other for a variety of reasons. And then finally, the conflict had to have been over for 18 months so that we could assess whether it was a government victory or a government loss. And that left us with about 60 conflicts. We purposely avoided, obviously, conflicts that cross international boundaries. They had to be basically two groups of citizens of the same country fighting each other for political power, either to take control of the government entirely or to establish a breakaway territory such as East Timor or Kosovo, Bangladesh, and so on. No, and that was relatively clear cut. There are a few conflicts which are sort of in a gray area. Some of the conflict in the region around Chad, for example, could be interpreted in different ways. And we wanted to avoid conflicts that were wars of colonial liberation, because they really are. They were more wars between a European power and a group of citizens in a colony trying to break away and establish their freedom. So that's more of an international conflict than an internal conflict, although there's often one or more groups of citizens who side with the colonial power for political, economic reasons. And so in that sense, there is a component of civil war to wars of colonial liberation, but we excluded those because we were looking specifically at internal conflicts. There were a couple of cases where we had to leave the conflict out of the study because there wasn't a government. The case of Angola, for example, is a conflict that began when Portugal rapidly evacuated Angola almost overnight, frankly, and left no power structure behind. They left a vacuum behind, and two forces within Angola then immediately sought to fill that vacuum. And the war in Angola went on for years as both sides struggled to create a government. So we in order for the study to be included, there had to be a government in place in the first place. In order to obviously assess whether or not it succeeded or failed in putting down the internal conflict. So that was the first phase, just establishing a list of conflicts and refining it to a manageable size, because we had a limited amount of time in which to do this. The second step was to create a laundry list of more than 60 mathematically quantifiable political, military, social, and economic factors that could conceivably have an impact on the outcome of an insurgency or civil war. And we deliberately left everything on that list that we could think of. We didn't do any real screening there because we wanted to cast the net as widely as possible for reasons for government failure. So everything from different poverty levels were tested, literacy levels, maternal and infant mortality rates, type of terrain, predominant religion, everything that we could think of. We put on the list of potential factors. And what we were looking for, and this is the heart of the study, is correlation between these quantifiable factors and government failure. So if a factor is present in half of government failures and not present in the other half, that's the definition of random. So 50% is purely coincidence, purely random chance, like flipping a coin. Half the time it'll turn up heads and half the time it'll turn up tails. And so we set the bar fairly high. We set the bar at 90% correlation with government failure for each of these factors. And then over the next 6 years, a team and teams of students at the Army War College, international fellows, visiting faculty, Army War College faculty, Army War College students, then proceeded to research the 60 conflicts and look for correlation with these 60 plus factors.
That's awesome. So, how many case studies were you able to complete in the study of internal conflict up till now, and what geographic regions are they oriented to?
Well, we did all 60 of the conflicts that we derived from the Correlates of War database, some of which were later excluded because they didn't meet the criteria for inclusion in the study. And we did all of them twice, and some of them 3 times, in double-blind studies, so that researchers doing a case study for the second time were not given access to the information determined by the researcher who had done the study the first time, because we didn't want any sort of interference or
That's interesting.
Influence on how that researcher perceived the study. So the answer is we did about 150 case studies of 60 some conflicts, and there are currently 52 on the website.
Awesome. So after collecting all this data and analyzing it over several years, what outcomes did it produce?
Well, it was really astonishing. I did not expect the clarity that came out of this going into the study. I expected that, if there were a scatter graph of where the 60 factors were plotted, that most of them would cluster around 50%. And indeed, most of them did cluster around 50%. But I was amazed that 5 of the factors just sort of leapt off the chart and were found in more than 90% of government failures, in some cases 100% of government failures. And there was quite a gap between these 5 and then the next group on the chart, which were down in the low 70s and upper 60 percentile ranges. So we called this then the 5 factors model, because these 5 factors just jumped out in the statistical data.
So what are the 5 factors, Chris? If you could summarize them real quick.
Sure. The first 2 are fairly closely linked, though they're often found together. What we were looking for was the sense of national identity of the population and the percentage of the population which believed its government to be legitimately in power. So we called that national identity. And we were looking for cases where at least 85% of the population of the country, the entire country, not just the insurgent zone, but the entire country, placed their personal identities at the level of the nation. For example, I am an American, or someone might say I am Peruvian or I am French. And then we were looking for 85% of the population expressing a belief that the government that was in power legitimately, as defined by standard political science language and definitions. So national identity and legitimacy of governance. Then population security. We set the bar at 85%, and we looked for cases where the government protected or failed to protect 85% of its population from meaningful contact with the guerrillas on a regular basis. We were looking basically for whether or not the government was able to create a firewall between the insurgents and the population. So that was set also at 85%. And then the other 2 factors were just simple Boolean yes or no equations. One was whether or not there was the presence of external sanctuary, whether insurgents had access across a land border in militarily significant numbers to sanctuary in a neighboring country, not necessarily support from a neighboring country, but sanctuary in freedom from pursuit, freedom from prosecution and deportation in a land border neighbor and then whether or not the government had a standing security force at the beginning of the conflict. And that really is sort of a minor factor because virtually every government on earth has some sort of standing security force, an army or a gendarmerie or what have you. But in cases where the government does not have a standing security force, like, for example, Iraq, or Afghanistan when we got there in 2001, the government invariably loses. That factor, we included it because there's a 100% government failure rate if they do not have a standing army. So those were the 5 factors, and the correlations with government defeat were remarkable. If less than 85% of the population of the country expresses a national identity, that government loses 94% of the time. 94% of governments of countries that did not have national identity lost their struggle with insurgents. Legitimacy of governance is even higher. 96% of conflicts in which the government is perceived as legitimate by less than 85% of the population result in insurgent victory. Population security is a 100% factor. If the government cannot protect 85% of its population from meaningful contact with the guerrillas 24/7, 365, the government loses. Plain and simple, there are no cases where the government protected less than 85% of its population and still prevailed against the insurgent movement. And then land border turned out to be if insurgents have a sanctuary in a neighboring country, they win 94% of the time. And as I mentioned before, if there's no standing army, the government always loses.
Wow, those are impressive results. And lucky for us, the study of internal conflict is transitioning to USF, so we're really excited about that. Really great. And if anybody in the audience wants to know more, they can go to our website. And underneath GNSI and the education column, you will see the study of internal conflict. So, how do you see the program evolving over the next couple of years after it has transitioned to USF?
That's a great question, Rob. I'm excited about the possibility of students getting involved now with the data and taking it, in their own directions. We were limited at the study of internal conflict at the Army War College in the amount of research hours that we could put against the project. We had a limited number of students and interns and fellows that could work on the program. Over 8 years, as I said before, more than 150 researchers contributed to the program, but we were forced to limit those conflicts that we studied. And I think now that the program's going to be at GNSI, we can maybe broaden the aperture on which conflicts we look at. For example, we could look at conflicts in which there were less than 1,000 fatalities in a 12-month period. We could broaden the database and look at more conflicts that we didn't have the resources to do at the Army War College. So, now that the data is out there, it'll be interesting to see what students and researchers want to do with it, where they want to take that.
Awesome. Well, we're proud to have USF students with us today who have some of the questions on their own about the study of internal conflict. So first off, I want to introduce Johan Armida. He's a graduate student at the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida. Johan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Dr. Burell. Dr. Mason, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today. I actually just finished a graduate seminar in civil wars, and I was exposed to a number of the literature on COIN and civil war outcomes. And interestingly, you brought up Angola. I just finished a final paper for that class on Cuban participation and support of the MPLA. So very apropos in terms of the topic here. I guess my question is, one of the books that I was exposed to in the Civil Wars class is by a scholar from Harvard called Jacqueline Hazelton. And her argument is that U.S. coin strategy has mostly pursued a good governance approach. So basically hearts and minds. And contrary to her data, what is more successful at coin is actually a carrot and stick or coercive approach, right? So she argues against trying to reduce civilian harm, taking a more like enemy-centric approach, co-opting elites to be able to achieve victory. In the SOIC database, is there support for that coercive approach, or do you find that the hearts and minds, beyond moral considerations, obviously, which do you think is there more support for, the good governance or the coercive approach? Thank you.
That's a great question. And it leads to one of the most remarkable and unexpected findings of the study of internal conflict, which is that the percentage of the population expressing a national identity and the percentage of the population which believes the government to be legitimate has never increased during the time of an internal conflict. It can go down, but it's never gone up. And we know this because our researchers have studied each of the insurgencies at different points in the timeline of the conflict, measuring the perception of national identity and the perception of government legitimacy. And we have found cases where that went down, but we have never found a case where it increased. Essentially, whatever the level of national identity and government legitimacy is on the first day of the conflict, it is what it's going to be or less when the conflict is over. And that has profound paradigm-changing repercussions for counterinsurgency doctrine, because the U.S. Joint Counterinsurgency Doctrine, as expressed in Joint Publication 3-24, is predicated on prescriptive actions to increase government legitimacy. That's essentially the crux of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. But what we found is that government legitimacy never increases. Nothing increases government legitimacy. And it's not the evidence, it's not the absence of evidence. Researchers looked for years for some case where actions taken during the build phase of clear, hold, and build had increased government legitimacy, their stated purpose. And we found dozens of studies showing that legitimacy, in fact, had not increased. And in many cases, support for the government had decreased because projects were poorly conceived or poorly executed. Security actually went down in conflict zones. Many of these reconstruction projects resulted in increased instability and an increase in guerrilla attacks. So, what that means is that, in fact, you can use the 5 factors model as a predictive tool to determine what the outcome of an insurgency is going to be, essentially, on the day the shooting starts. Because there are a couple of outlying cases where a government has had one of these 5 factors against it and still prevailed. A government, if governments lose 96% of the time, that means 4% of the time they suppress the insurgency. So there are outliers in which one of the 5 factors have been against the government, but there are no cases where 2 or more of the 5 factors have been against the government, and the government has survived. The way statistical analysis works is you cross-multiply the morbidity factors, and if 2 or more factors are present, the chances of government success are literally nil. Statistically, far less than 0.1%. So, knowing this and knowing that the percentage of the population expressing a national identity and the percentage of a population believing its government to be legitimate has never increased, if those 2 factors are against the government at the start of the conflict, it's time to start negotiating, because the government is going to lose either sooner or later. So that I think that was one of the most remarkable findings of the study to me was the accuracy that the model has in predicting government failure. And in fact, both of these models that have been written about so much in the literature of counterinsurgency, the enemy-centric model or the population-centric model, are effectively rendered moot by the statistical analysis of the conflict since the end of World War II.
Hey, Johan, thank you very much for that excellent question. And I did want to mention that Dr. Mason also has an excellent article, U.S. Coin Doctrine is Wrong, which was published in Parameters magazine a couple years ago. So offer that up to take a look. Okay, we also have with us today May Birch, honors student at USF, former president of the Future Strategist Program. May, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. My question is not going to be as good as Johan's. He was very prepared. But I had read over all of the 5 kind of categories that gives you guys an idea of when a government fails during insurgencies. And you kind of answered this in the last question, but I wanted to go more into depth about this. So with this data, you had said that, during the insurgency, you'll be able to tell when the government fails, because you'll see that, maybe every once in a while, if they only have one of the factors, they could still succeed. But if they have 2 or more, they will fail. What are some ways that you kind of see in the future that we use those kind of 5 categories to be able to tell when a government will fail? Do you think it would be more of a data analysis, and maybe that's done through, especially since you're moving to USF, through like GNSI students looking at current affairs and looking at insurgencies around the world? Or do you think it'll be more of a hindsight thing of we'll look at an insurgency afterwards and be able to point out, okay, this was why, because it met these 2 or more categories?
Excellent question, and it goes right to the heart of why the study was started, and why it emerged from the book that I wrote in 2014, looking at the commonalities of failure in South Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In all of those cases, we put American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in harm's way in support of governments which ultimately failed. In Saigon, of course, it was just last week was the 50th anniversary of the fall of the South Vietnam and the reunification of Vietnam. And I think what struck me as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan went sideways was the extent to which we were forgetting the lessons of South Vietnam and putting our military personnel in danger in support of governments that ultimately failed. And so my idea originally was to create a kind of a rubric, a decision-making model that would help senior defense officials and civilian leaders make informed decisions about whether or not to commit U.S. military personnel to combat on the ground in places like South Vietnam or Afghanistan, based on what statistical analysis tells us about what the outcome is going to be. So it was originally envisioned as a predictive tool, as a decision-making model that leadership could use to determine what U.S. military response should be, whether we were in favor of the government, as we were, for example, in Baghdad or Afghanistan, or whether we were opposed to the government and were supporting the rebels, as we did, for example, in Syria for many years, as we worked to support the people, the resistance there in deposing the Assad regime. And interesting, all 4 of those cases, in all 4 of those cases, the statistics bore out the ultimate results in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and South Vietnam. So the idea was to create a predictive tool. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as a historical project to be able to look back in hindsight and say, well, I mean, you obviously know that was going to happen. And I think think maybe that's the historical value of historical analysis and looking at cases in the past to establish what the statistics tell us about government success and failure. But the original idea was, in fact, to inform U.S. military and civilian leadership about what the outcome of a conflict was going to be before we sent troops into harm's way.
All right, May, thank you very much for that excellent question. So, Chris, unfortunately, I think we're about out of time, but this is not the last. We're going to hear about the study of internal conflict as we bring this entire program online here at USF and try to get the best results we can from it as we move forward. Thank you for joining us today. GNSI is looking forward to working with you and this program as it evolves over the next few years.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to the students who participated today. I'm looking forward to working with GNSI and you and University of South Florida and all the students there to move this project forward.
All right, great. Cheers.
Many thanks today to Drs. Rob Burell and Chris Mason for their discussion about the Study of Internal Conflict Research Project, which we'll now be calling USF and GNSI its home. We expect those case studies and additional data like that discussed today to be available in the next few days on the GNSI website. Keep an eye out for that. Next week on At the Boundary, our special guest will be Dr. Tracy Perez-Colmus. She was scheduled to lead a breakout session at Tampa Summit 5 in March, but conference karma had other ideas to no one's liking. But she has agreed to be a guest on the podcast next week, and she'll be discussing her work at USHU, otherwise known as the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. We're really looking forward to talking with Tracy next week. If you don't want to miss it or any of our future episodes, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be worthy of attention and discussion. I'm Glenn Beckmann. Thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next week at the Boundary.